So the exhibition actually starts downstairs with the entrance spaces into the show, but this is the first gallery space proper. And what we wanted to do in this room was to bring together some of the earliest works that are included in the exhibition. So they're not all exclusively historic, but they are earlier than some of the other galleries. And this room has quite an austere kind of feel, and it sets up, in a way, some of the problems that painters through the middle of the 20th century, right up until today, were having to kind of negotiate in thinking about how, after that very particular moment in the 1950s when Greenberg had kind of set his rules for painting and kind of modernist painting, and modernism felt like it was almost painting itself into a corner, and abstract paintings were ubiquitous, they were expensive, they were the contemporary art market. How another generation of painters coming after that were able to start thinking about how you can make abstract paintings after that kind of end of painting had been sort of had been proposed in a sense. And so the exhibition, the subtitle is International Abstract Art from the 1960s to now, but the earliest works in the exhibition and in this room are these two paintings by an American painter called Byron Stout. He's a very little known artist, certainly in the UK, but even in the States he's not so well known, and he made very few paintings during his life. But he did make these extraordinarily meticulous, handcrafted, and very highly worked. He would spend literally years working on these canvases. And they're all of these very simple, very kind of graphic icons. And if you think, you know, this one's 1956, if you think about the other kind of work that was being made in 1956, this really was beginning to, I mean, it was ahead of its time, really, is the simplest way of talking about it. It was beginning to announce some of the ideas and some of the kind of the languages that painters would begin to start dealing with over the subsequent decade, 2 decades. So they're in here as a kind of prologue to the show. And it's always good to break rules, so it's great that the exhibition begins at 1960, but the earliest work's 1956. Another of the key ideas that runs through the whole show is this notion of representation. And you know, once you have abstract painting as a kind of thing, you know, how do you make abstract paintings after that, 10, 15, 20 years later, that aren't just pictures of what abstract paintings look like, if you like? So painters were beginning to think about how do you reintroduce the authentic without just looking like you're repeating or sampling a style or an image. So these ideas of representation, the real or the represented, is a key kind of theme. And this work, which is an extraordinary piece by Michael Craig Martin, was made in the 1990s. It was a group of work that he was working on for a very small amount of time, a very short period. And I was talking to Michael earlier. He was here in the galleries, and he said that he made this painting and a number of others like it. They were in an exhibition once in the early 90s. Nobody said they liked them. Nobody said they didn't like them. Nobody talked about them. He never thought about them again. And in actual fact, this painting was destroyed. And when Daniel went to him and said, we'd really love to include this work in the show, Michael said, well, it doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed. Nobody was ever interested in those paintings. So he actually remade this, especially for the exhibition here. And it's really exciting, I think, for us to be able to bring a work like that, which maybe at that moment didn't quite find its audience or its place, but to bring it into a room like this and to really think about it again in the context of some of these other artists. And it's an extraordinary thing. It's called a mirror painting. It's very simple. You have black lines on this side, red lines on this side, but because of the mirror, as you walk across the painting is transformed either all black or all red. Very simple, but very beautiful. And then, you know, some of the other artists in this room are again dealing with that kind of expanded idea of painting. This is perhaps the most sculptural object in the whole exhibition. It's a work by Imi Knöbel, but there is a painted element. There's this black square, which again refers back to this history of painting, Malevich's black square that was made in the early 20th century. And he's kind of rested it on this sort of arrangement of boxes and this kind of strange plinth. And so it's again beginning to think about the space that painting occupies, you know, how you can, more kind of provisional ideas of how painting can deal with those histories and legacies. The last work to talk about in this room is again by an artist who's less well known than some of the other artists in the show, a French painter called Martin Barre. And Martin Barre was working in the kind of 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. At that time, you know, painting was very unfashionable. It was all about kind of minimalism. Conceptual art was beginning through the 60s and into the 70s. And as a painter, I think he was trying to negotiate these ideas within his practice, still making paintings. And so one of his series, we have these 3 works from, are these very beautiful spray paintings. So, you know, the canvases are primed and they're taped around the edges. And then he just uses these very, very simple gestures with the spray can. And it's about, you know, what's the least possible amount you can do to still produce an image and still produce a painting, and to kind of to occupy a canvas in a way. But actually they become incredibly powerful because they're so reduced. And you know, he even tries to remove the mark of the painter's hand by using spray can. It's very difficult to control, and it's a very uniform way of producing a line. But you get these very sort of sparse, minimal, you know, they look absolutely of their moment. So we have this quite unusual space at Tate St Ives, which is kind of it's like a showcase. Originally it was made as a showcase for ceramics, but we haven't used it in that strict sense for a while now. We always try and think about how we can think about what we put in this space. And it provided an opportunity for us to bring a really, I think, exciting group of works together, which begin to expand some of the ideas that are developed in the first room. So this work by André Cadet is called The Bar de Boisserande. And André Cadet was a very interesting artist, again, working in the 70s. And this, again, is one of those works that really challenges what a painting is, or how we can describe what sort of terms you can describe a painting in, because they're these objects, these round bars of wood that he produced, and he would carry them around. So they were very performative, and the act of him walking to his exhibition carrying this thing was very much part of the work and the way that the work should be experienced. And so he would lean these against the wall in the exhibition spaces of his own exhibitions, but also more frequently he began to visit other people's exhibitions with these and then just leave them in the gallery spaces. So he'd start to sort of occupy other people's spaces, and it was a kind of subversive gesture. And he was an artist who was very interested in those ideas of kind of itinerancy and statelessness and a kind of nomadic existence. And he tried to find a way of producing a painting, a painted object in this case, that had that kind of itinerant status, if you like. These works by Bob Law are very interesting. He's the only artist who has a direct relationship with St Ives and Penzance, and Bob Law lived in St Ives for many years. But it's interesting because he was never really part of that St Ives group that we associate with this place. And in fact, he was much more connected with Europe, and in particular with Germany. He was showing at a gallery called Conrad Fischer Gallery, which is a really important gallery through the 60s and 70s. And so his audience and his reception was often much more European than it was British. So it's really nice to, again, be able to bring these works back to this place, which was very important to him, and to put them back into this kind of context. These monochromes are very interesting. They're by an American artist called Sherry Levine. And again, one of the ideas in the show is about how painters are able to make paintings after the so-called the end of painting. And the monochrome, of course, was first produced by Malevich in the beginning of the 20th century. So any artist making a monochrome now is essentially remaking something, a gesture that's already happened 100 years ago. And Sherry Levine's interesting because she's not exclusively a painter. She came to prominence in the 70s, late 70s, 80s in New York. And she was very much part of a movement dubbed appropriation art. So she was alongside artists like Cindy Sherman and Richard Prince. And her work was about looking at art that had already been produced and taking elements and recontextualizing it. So it was a kind of Duchampian idea of using the artwork as a ready-made, appropriating it, but giving it meaning. And it's a very postmodern idea, which absolutely fits with that time, you know, the 70s, 80s. And apparently, Sherry Levine had been thinking about how she could make a monochrome painting. What would it mean for how would she appropriate a monochrome painting? How could she make sense of that within her own practice? And she was actually working with a printer on a digital reproduction of an artwork for a book. And when she was going through this process with this printer, they were producing these various kind of colour charts where the colours that were being used to reproduce the image were being isolated as printers marks at the bottom. And she suddenly realised that she had this series of monochromes that had been kind of ready-made to her, that had come out of another work she'd made. And so she very simply took these pieces of wood and just replicated these colours, and it was her way of making her own monochrome. They look like they could be Yves Klein or something. I think it's actually called after Yves Klein. It is Meltdown after Yves Klein, referring back to that other work, but doing it in a completely contemporary way and out of a process which is entirely contemporary, digital printing. Okay. So this is a work by Peter Young, who's another American artist who was in New York City in the 60s, I think into the early 70s. And then he left New York and actually became not exactly a recluse, but he was for a moment, he was very much part of the art world in New York, and then he decided to leave it. His work was very interesting because he seemed to be absolutely influenced by what was going on at that time in the 60s, 70s. This is very kind of op art painting. It's a little like a kind of Bridget Riley. But of course, where Bridget Riley, if she was making a painting of dots like this, would have every dot absolutely perfectly produced and, flat and, sort of sharp. And this painting, when you get up to the surface, you see that these blobs are very, it has a very handmade quality. It's much less formal and much more immediate. And actually, the way that he made this painting was to try and make every dot the same distance away from every other dot, which is an interesting way to start a painting. And then, of course, is impossible. But what you get is this very sort of human. You really get the sense of there's a kind of informality, which I think was really interesting, and which was, again, a million miles away from the sort of seriousness of high modernism and that kind of Greenbergian idea. Here was this idea that you could make a painting by coming up with a kind of really dumb idea of trying to make every dot the same distance away, and then you just go for it, and there's drips and there's blobs, but there's a real kind of humour and energy to the surface. And I think Peter Young then went on to become very interested in ideas of tribal art and began making works where he would stretch using kind of pieces of kind of rough-hewn wood, and the canvas would be stretched across. So it looked almost like a kind of Native American Indian artifact or object. So you had this coming together of the kind of high and not exactly the low, but a kind of more primitive vernacular, which I think is really, really fascinating in his work. There's a great quote from him in the catalogue where somebody asked him why he left New York City. He said, the question isn't why I left New York, it's why I ever went there in the first place, which sort of says a lot, I think, about his attitude. Okay. So we're in Gallery 3 now, and many of the works in this room seem to demonstrate a kind of more pop sensibility. So, I mean, this is evident very obviously in the Andy Warhol painting, Eggs, which is a really, it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. And again, it's absolutely perfect in sort of allowing one to think about that idea which this exhibition tries to set up of, what is an abstract painting and what is a representational painting, because it's a fairly good graphic representation of eggs, and the design was actually taken from a greetings card, so a real object in the world and a representation. But of course, the way that Warhol produces it on this scale and with these colours is absolutely referring to a kind of tradition of abstract art. So he finds a way of making his own abstract painting with it still being absolutely an Andy Warhol, and constantly complicating that idea of abstraction on the one hand and representation on the other. And also, I think, again, drawing attention to the fact that nowadays those languages of abstraction have so much become part of the vernacular of design and architecture, fabrics, fashion, wallpapers. Things are constantly being co-opted. There isn't this pure space that abstract painting could occupy anymore. And most of the painters in this exhibition are not interested in that space. They're interested in the space of the real world and how they can think about the way that those things kind of oscillate backwards and forwards. So a number of the other artists, Peter Halley, who was he's an American painter who came to prominence again in the early 80s and was absolutely again part of this sort of tradition of this, it was at the same time as Sherry Levine with appropriation art, but again thinking about painting in a very postmodern sense, thinking about how you can reintroduce abstract imagery into paintings that are also kind of representational. So he talks about these very much as they're kind of cells and conduits. So they're almost sort of diagrams. And he uses this diagrammatic idea and structure in order to produce paintings which are constantly on the verge between representation and abstraction. And he uses these amazing Rolotex paints, which are like a kind of Artex. You get this surface. So again, it's this thing that you buy in the hardware store. He's deliberately not using acrylic or oil paints. He's going down to his local hardware store, buying this stuff that you decorate a ceiling with, and using that to get this amazing, amazing texture. So in Gallery 4, a lot of the same ideas are continued, but here we have maybe something more to do with sort of process and with systems, and the way that often painters, in order to, when faced with the blank canvas and wondering how to fill it, if you like, would think about imposing a series of structures or processes or systems in order that they can then subvert those in some way. So you see that with a painting like this one by Bridget Riley. She was really thinking very much about colour in this work. The work's called Cantus Firmus, which refers to a kind of musical, compositional. And I think she was thinking about the way that, these bands of colour, these stripes of colour, could be read almost musically or almost compositionally, and how the colours would operate in these different sequences. And so she sets up this system and then she produces it. In a work like this one by Heimo Zobernig, who's an Austrian artist, this is a work from 2008, he often looks back at the conventions of modernist painting. So he's done a number of works based on Mondrian paintings, for instance. He makes monochrome still. And he has this kind of grid that he uses quite a lot. And here you've got this kind of masked grid, which is then subverted by suddenly breaking down with these curves and these gestural marks, which again, they're not gestural at all. They're exactly the same. They're produced in the same way as the grid. They're tape that's been cut and carefully masked off. But again, it's a subversion of a system to produce this kind of dynamic surface. And then I think maybe this painting by Bernard Fries is again a really great way of thinking about almost that idea of found painting. And again, how you might start, or how you might make a painting now. What do? You take a brush. How do you get rid of that gestural mark? How do you try and do something that feels like it's more real or more authentic or more of the world? And in this particular painting, Bernard Fries's response to that, I guess, was he would leave his paint pots open overnight. So in the morning he would come in and there was a skin that had formed on the circular paint pot. And he would take the skin off, and it was a perfect disc with wet paint on the back, and he would just apply it directly to the canvas. And then over time he would just keep applying these spots of pure colour, pure paint, and he produces this composition. So it's that kind of Duchampian idea of the ready-made, the thing that you take and it's a nice way of introducing the real and the authentic back into the painting, I think. And then we sort of come to, it's certainly not a conclusion, but this is the final room, Gallery 5. You remember we started in Gallery 1 with a very austere space in some senses, and this is the absolute opposite. It's bright, it's zippy, it's really very, very kind of vibrant, and many of the works in here are more contemporary. So I think it's nice to end on this, looking a little bit at what some of the younger painters now, the positions they're taking. So we have this extraordinary work by Peter Davis, who's a British artist, where again, it's that sense of, it's a very illustrious tradition of the grid. We all know the grid, we've seen it 100 times. But Peter's grid painting that he made in the late 90s is all hand-drawn. And so it gets a bit wobbly. And then once he's drawn this grid that kind of goes all over the place. He then hand colours each square individually. So the element of time and labour that's invested in this process is really, really evident. And it produces this really kind of psychedelic, amazing surface, which is all about pattern and, you know, almost a bit like a kind of fabric design. But again, where, you know, 30 years before, somebody might have made a painting like this at that moment in a much more controlled and serious way, in the late 90s in London, there's this element of a kind of slackness or a kind of relaxed quality or, again, a humour that's coming back into this. And as I say, it's not, you know, the Peter Young that we saw was made many years earlier, but seems to share a similar sensibility to somebody like Peter Davis working sort of 20-odd, 30 years later. This work by Mary Harman, again, has a similar kind of attitude, I think. And I think in Mary Harman's work, it's really the attitude and her attitude to painting and also to life that comes through so strongly. So she's made paintings, again, which often refer to what you would think of as very sort of old hat kind of motifs, very sort of tried and tested. You'd think that a lot of the kinds of paintings that she's making have been emptied of meaning now, have kind of come to an end. But it's in the way that she makes her paintings, it's in her attitude. She's a woman who's interested in music and film and pop culture, and she brings a kind of energy to her paintings and a sort of a kind of joy for the act of painting itself, which seems to translate through the canvases. And she also makes these amazing chairs which you can sit on to look at the paintings, and which, you know, visitors to the gallery will be able to do.
I think we should see you.
Shall I demonstrate?
Brilliant.
They're very comfortable, actually. They make you want to sit and stare at something for a long time. For me, at a moment like this, you know, just 2 hours after the last painting's been hung on the wall, it's the opportunity to finally see the exhibition and to really think about what it means and think about what we've done. It's been a 2-year process, and I think, yeah, no, it's exciting to see it and almost to try and see it for the first time now and see what it really looks like. But I'm nervous as well, because I think it's a different kind of show to some of the other shows I've done, in as much as we have been, you know, we haven't tried to control every element of it. We've tried to follow the work and follow the paintings and let them be our guide. And so in a sense, I'm really hoping that by putting that trust in the works, that will be repaid, and I think it will be, because I think walking through it even now, I just get more excited every time I see it.